Hello all. Thanks again for tuning in. Tonight we'll be exploring the intricacies of one of the English language's most influential pieces of literature, Tolstoy's greatest work, War and Peace. Oh god, that doesn't work on so many levels. Obviously, I'm actually here to talk about book 1 of the Animorphs series, The Invasion, by K.A. Applegate. Mine's not in the greatest condition, but trust me, there used to be a super 90s Beast Wars level computer rendering of an Anole right here. Animorphs number 1 was published roughly 500 years ago in the far erstwhile age of 1996. Like all the books in the main series, it's told from a first-person perspective of one of the main characters. In this case, Jake, the quote-unquote leader. It consists of 27 chapters, 184 pages, and it kicks off a series that, while generally forgotten by the modern age, lasted for 5 years and contains more than 60 books. The book itself is decent. I mean, it's a little hard to critique a lone entry in a series that's clearly meant to be part of a much larger narrative from the very beginning. You know, anything that resembles a plot hole can just sort of be written off as something that they'll explain later. But the minutia of the story, which might seem pointless in a standalone at the time, sort of offers the reader a promise that it might mean something more important later on. So I'm not even going to try to review book 1 of a 54-plus book long series as a singular book. It's just not going to happen. So let's move on to the synopsis. Technically, this is where I should offer a spoiler warning, but seeing as how the book came out 20 years ago and the series as a whole has more or less been completely forgotten by society, outdated memes aside, wonk, I can't imagine anybody's going to care. Animorphs number 1 follows Jake, the reluctant leader of the Animorphs team. The story opens with Jake and Marco hanging out at the local mall's arcade when they bump into Jake's cousin Rachel and her friend Cassie, as well as the nerdy kid from school, Tobias. On the way home, the kids decide to cut through the abandoned construction site as a shortcut, where they stumble upon, of course, an alien crash landing. The centaur-like Andalite in the crashed ship informs the children of the incipient Yeerk invasion on Earth, and knowing that he's gonna die, grants them the Andalite power to morph, which in this case means to turn into any animal that they can touch. Just as this is happening, a bunch of controllers show up in their own spaceships, and while the children hide, Visser 3, a high-ranking Yeerk and purportedly the only Yeerk to ever infest an Andalite host, and therefore the only Yeerk with the ability to morph, murders the Andalite prince Elfangor in the most dramatic of ways. Fuck morphs into a giant alien beast and eats that motherfucker! Over the coming days, it becomes apparent that the strange events of that night were not, in fact, a dream, as Jake hoped. Tobias shows up at one point and morphs into a cat, and then Jake tries it out by morphing into his family dog. It's a whole thing. After that, things move at a pretty even clip. Accepting the reality of the situation, Rachel, Cassie, and Marco also jump on board with varying degrees of reluctance. The group reconvenes at Cassie's parents' wildlife rehabilitation center, acquiring more than a few morphs from the handful of animals convalescing therein. After that, things progress fairly quickly. The kids visit a meeting of the Sharing. The Sharing is an organization that's basically a front for the Yeerk invasion. It's presented as a sort of unisex Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts, but its real purpose is to recruit voluntary controllers. So, during the beach barbecue, Jake does a little recon work, disguised as a stray dog, and manages to confirm not only that his older brother Tom is in fact a controller, but also that Assistant Principal Chapman of the kids' school is also a high-ranking controller. So, obviously, the next logical move is for Jake to morph into a lizard during school hours in his locker so that he can spy on Chapman in hopes that he might reveal some sort of vulnerability to the Yeerks. Just by chance, as soon as he manages to escape the vent slots in his locker, Chapman walks by. Jake follows him into a janitor's closet where he does some knob turning and lever pulling or somewhat, and the wall opens up, revealing a staircase descending down into the ground. Convinced that this is an entrance to the Yeerk pool, Yeerks have to return to the Yeerk pool every 3 days to soak up some Kandrona rays. The team resolves to attack the Yeerks where they're most vulnerable. Unfortunately, with only a dog, cat, hawk, and horse morph between the 5 of them, they're pretty sure they're gonna bite it pretty fast. Fortunately, one of Cassie's veterinarian parents works at the local theme park / zoo, the Gardens. So basically you've got these 5 preteens sneaking backstage, so to speak, at a zoo so that they can acquire some of the world's most dangerous animals. Jake and Marco get separated from Cassie and Rachel at one point. Marco acquires a gorilla. There's a brief chase with security that leads to them having to hide inside the tiger enclosure. And after basically tripping over a sleeping tiger, Jake, in a valiant act of, oh dear God, please don't kill me, acquires its DNA. Whenever the Animorphs acquire an animal, it enters a sort of calm trance state. So a slightly more tactical move than just, hey, it would be cool to be able to turn into a tiger. In the end, Marco and Jake have to book it through the exhibit to escape, almost ending up as tiger shit in the process. But they make it up the ladder, and the team regroups. And finally, it is time for the first tactical strike against the Yeerks. That night, the kids meet at the school, minus Cassie, who has gone mysteriously missing. Nevertheless, the team decides to proceed with the plan, which is to sneak into the school and head down into the Yeerk pool. As they soon discover, this appears to only be one entrance of many throughout town, leading into a huge subterranean cavern, so the kids find a shed of sorts to hide behind, so they can morph safely without being observed. Rachel is an African elephant, Marco is a gorilla, Tobias is a hawk, and Jake is a motherfucking Siberian tiger. At this point, their main goal is just finding and freeing Jake's brother Tom, so the kids just go apeshit. No offense, Marco, and set to releasing as many prisoners and destroying as much shit as they possibly can. They do find Tom Yeerk-free and frightened, as well as Cassie, who I guess was snatched earlier in the day, hence her absence. And having accomplished their goals, they set to make a hasty retreat, but you'll never guess who happens to be visiting the Yeerk pool tonight. Visser 3. Fortunately, for the purpose of self-preservation, the Visser assumes that these animals are Andalite bandits in Morph. Ultimately, it doesn't matter because he wants them fucking dead. So he turns into some giant alien beastie and starts spitting fireballs everywhere. In the end, the kids do manage to escape mostly. Tom falls off the horse. That was Cassie, by the way. And Tobias is separated from the group, but Jake, Rachel, Cassie, and Margot do manage to make it home safely. And that's pretty much it. The next day, the team regroups, only to discover that Tobias, while he did survive the night, is now forever trapped in the body of a hawk. There's a 2-hour time limit on morphs. I don't know if I mentioned that. So that's the invasion. Overall, it's fine. I mean, it kicks off the series with a decent balance of excitement, intrigue, and even, like, day-to-day domesticity. I can't believe Jake didn't make the basketball team. It's kind of a generic story. I mean, a lot of the narrative is sort of cliche by modern standards, and every single cultural reference in it is severely dated. I mean, I didn't notice as a kid. I mean, they weren't dated back then. But as an adult, living in this modern, insane age where everybody is connected to everybody else every minute of every day, it's a bit of culture shock. Even with the knowledge and experience that 20 years ago, that's just not the way the world worked. Again, it's really tough to critique as a standalone the first book in what was clearly planned from the beginning as a long-running series. So I won't. Now comes the fun part of the video, where I point out every little detail that stands out to me through the smudged lens of my terrible grown-up mind. In the very first chapter, Jake and Marco are hanging out at the arcade, and Marco makes some generic, bland comment about how you have to fight the sleaze troll after you cross the Nether Fjord. Shit like this always pisses me off. There were plenty of arcade games in the 90s. I mean, why would the author feel the need to make up bland, generic, video gamey sounding words when a quick trip to the local arcade would provide them with plenty of real-life details for this minor scene that doesn't even matter? I mean, what? You've never heard of Pac-Man? It's like on television or in some movies where you see someone who's supposed to be playing video games and all they do is sit there and wiggle the sticks back and forth and mash the buttons as frantically as possible. I mean, are actors so busy that they don't have time to sit down and play a game for 10 minutes? During the scene in the construction site, Visser 3 is communicating with the Andalite prince through thought speak. See, Andalites don't have mouths, so they communicate telepathically. That's also how the Animorphs communicate when they're morphed. But why are they speaking English? I mean, I know, it's science fiction, so far be it from me to say how it should work. Maybe everyone just hears thought speak in the language they're most familiar with. But it just strikes me as odd that these two aliens that share a common language would be speaking in English, one of over 6,000 languages on a planet that they only recently arrived on. I mean, obviously the real reason is for ease of storytelling, but come on. Oh, also, there's a UFO crash landing, several UFO non-crash landings, and a monster several stories tall devouring an alien. Seriously, how is nobody hearing this? Jake has to call around to check in with everybody. I mean, yeah, I know that's the way things were back then, but it still just seems so bizarre from a modern perspective. I mean, what even is a landline? At one point, Jake is talking about Tobias's troubled home life, and he mentions how he's been shipped around from aunt to uncle to aunt to uncle, and at one point he says that one of them was on the other coast. That pretty strongly implies that this takes place on one of the two continental US coasts. That's another thing. Every book seems to open with the whole, I can't tell you my last name or where I'm from speech. I mean, that makes sense, in a way. The characters are trying to maintain a degree of anonymity. But the story is, for the most part, still told from a first-person, present-tense perspective, as if everything's happening as you're reading it. So, are these kids writing manifestos after the fact? I mean, do they have perfect eidetic memory that they can remember all the minute details of every conversation and event that happens to them? Jake mentions only being able to see Tobias's eyes in his memory. That makes sense, given the circumstances, but I happen to know that Tobias does regain the ability to assume his human form later on. So you gotta wonder, how far after the fact are these toddlers writing these manifestos? This book also features the first mention of a common description within the series. For years, whenever K.A. was describing a morph, particularly into mammals, she would always say something about the knees switching directions. Again, I know it's science fiction, so I can't say how it should work, but that's not really how legs work. I mean, I understand the misconception. In fact, as a kid, it didn't strike me as odd until I literally read a letter to K.A. Applegate on the Animorphs website complaining about it. But as an adult, with at least a decent understanding of evolutionary biology, it doesn't really make sense. I mean, take a dog. Yeah, when you look at it, it does kind of look like the legs bend the opposite direction of humans. But what a lot of people don't seem to understand is that dogs, and in fact most quadrupeds, walk on their toes. The bit that people, or at least K.A. Applegate, seem to see as the knee is in fact the equivalent of the human's heel. And then they have relatively short tibia, and then the thigh sort of melds into the body a little bit, lending to the confusion. Again, I get the misconception, but even after that letter, that description continued at least as long as I continued reading. When Jake first morphs his dog Homer, he picks up the scent of another male dog off of Tobias's shoe. Now, don't get me wrong, I know that dogs have a very keen sense of smell and they can ascertain data from a scent that we as human beings couldn't even conceive of. But some of the details here are stupidly specific. I mean, how can a dog tell through a smell that another dog's name is Streak? He also says he's neutered, like me. Now, maybe a dog can tell if another dog is neutered through smell, but they make a point to specify that physical changes, as opposed to DNA, don't affect a morph. So, while Homer might be neutered, Jake's dog morph should not be. I don't know. It's established in this first book that clothing generally doesn't morph, but if you wear something sufficiently skin tight, it can be absorbed into a morph and reappear when you resume human form. Now, I get that this is mostly, again, a product of narrative convenience. It'd be a huge hassle in terms of storytelling if every time they became humans again, they had to find clothing somewhere. But objectively, doesn't make a lot of sense. At one point, Marco mentions a video game called Dead Zone 5. Now, while there was technically a game on the original Famicom disk system called Dead Zone, as far as I can tell, it did not have any sequels or even see an international release, so this just reeks of more generic video game culture bullshit. When Tobias first morphs back into a human from a hawk, it is said that his feathers ran together and merged and turned pink. It was like the feathers were melting, like they had turned into wax and were being heated up. Again, this is the bio-enthusiast in me, but do feathers really have DNA in them? I mean, I don't feel like looking it up right now, but in my mind, feathers are more or less the same as hair, and hair technically doesn't have any DNA in it, it's all protein. So if I'm honest with myself, it doesn't really make sense that a character can morph into an animal and then morph back to a human being with the exact same haircut. Based off of the local fauna and flora mentioned throughout the series, as well as details like being on one of the coasts and having a local amusement park / zoo, I feel like I might actually be able to nail down roughly where the series takes place, or at least prove that the author didn't put too much thought into it. Either way, I can surreptitiously feel better about myself for 5 minutes. At least I'm smarter than the Yerks, so that's something. Oh, and that's another thing. When Jake first morphs into a lizard, he kind of loses control of the instincts a little bit and ends up eating a spider. And that got me thinking, how do stomach contents and the like work with the whole morphing thing? I mean, let's say Marco gets really hungry and he eats like 2 hamburgers and some fries and then 10 minutes later decides he's going to morph into a mouse. I mean, what happens to the food in his stomach? Does it morph with him? Does it sort of erupt out? Is there vomiting? Who knows? Now, I admit, these are all nitpicky details that don't really speak to the value of the storytelling as a whole, but who cares? That's half the fun. That's the whole reason I started this thing in the first place. So I guess that's it. Thanks again for tuning in. Is there actually a video game out there I don't know about that has sleaze trolls and nether fjords in it? Do feathers have DNA in them? If you know and I don't, please let me know in the comments. If you liked this video, tell your friends. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and tune in next time when I review book number 2, The Visitor. Until then.